There you go.
Okay, I think we're recording. If not, we'll go from there. Diane Leclerc is a great friend and colleague. We first met. She doesn't remember this probably. I do. Do you remember when we first met, Diane? Put you on the spot.
Was it Asbury?
Well done. For an old person, that's a good memory. It was in Asbury, I think in 2005. She came to me, and I think maybe John had just left 10 miles. So we need a pastor for our church or something like that. But I was sitting with my friend Eric Severson, and so we chatted, and of course we got more deeply connected. Never knew we'd be colleagues together a couple years later. Diane is professor of theology and history at NNU. Is beginning her, Diane, is it 18, 19 years? 22? I forget.
23.
23 years. I can't even count that high. She started when she was 11. And so she and I do a lot of work together. This will come up in our conversation as well. She's been in pastoral ministry for a while, some pastorates in the Northeast, and then came to NNU, as you heard, 23 years ago. Is actually, of course, the longest tenured faculty member on our team, and a great colleague for sure. What will come up in our time together is a book we've just written, and we're looking for a publisher who's worthy of it, is On the Backside of the Cross. And really that book puts together some passions each of us have had. And that really, the conversation today on Theodicy, actually in our Wesleyan response to it, it drives a lot of that book, to be honest. So Diane, go ahead. Our plan, folks, is to chat for a little bit and have some questions at the end. Obviously, if you have questions in the middle, you can, but we'll kind of go for a little bit. And then by probably 11:30, 35, we'll kind of turn it over for your thoughts and comments and questions. But go ahead, Diane, go ahead and begin our conversation on a Wesleyan response to Theodicy.
Okay, as Brent mentioned, we've just finished a book. It took 5 years to write. And so I really could say that I could talk about this in my sleep. I think I wrote some of the book in my sleep. It's been a part of our lives for a long time. The subtitle, by the way, is Atonement Theology for the Abused and Abandoned. So we want to talk particularly to those where the cross, of course, is to save sinners, but does the cross have anything to say to the sinned against in their situations of abuse and abandonment? We introduced the book by making a claim that Theodicy really does nothing for the sufferer. It's a philosophical quest, sometimes theological quest. We have, of course, lots of different answers to the problem of evil. The problem of evil, of course, is if God is all loving and all powerful, why does he allow particularly innocent suffering in the world? And so Theodicy really has tried through the years to answer that question, to make some sort of logical sense of that question. And there really have been probably 8 or 9 attempts to answer that. All of them, however, can be refuted actually quite easily because they do not work. Probably the one that the Wesleyans have gone to most of the time is something called the free will defense. I'm sure most of you can articulate that. The question about the free will defense is it assumes that God knows the future. So I think most of us would affirm that, maybe not. Maybe some of us are more open theists, but let's say that God knows the future and he understands when he creates Adam and Eve and can see into the future all of the horrific, evil-driven consequences of a fallen world, from famine, war, holocausts, to a 3-year-old who's raped. I mean, but the cumulative history of what God can foresee, he still opts to give us free will because he loves us. And one could make the claim that perhaps the weight is out of balance, and that God perhaps shouldn't have created us in a way where evil would enter the world. Did he know that Adam and Eve would fall, et cetera, et cetera? So the analogy that I use for the free will defense is, let's say my son, he's actually 24 now, but there was some point in his life where I allowed him to cross the street by himself. So I gave him street free will. Of course, I taught him how to cross the street, made sure that he understood the principles. I asked my students, when does this happen? They usually say something like 7 or 8 years old. If I were the kind of mother that I would want to be, then I would probably still hold his hand at 24 years old. But, at some point you need to give your child street free will. Well, let's say that we decide to go to the park, and it's time for him to make a decision of whether to cross the street or not. And unfortunately, he doesn't follow the rules. He doesn't look both ways, and he steps out into traffic. And a Mack truck is barreling down on him. And I have this awareness that something horrific is going to happen to my son. As a loving parent, what am I going to do? I have an opportunity to grab him and pull him back to the curb. But what would I do if I were following the rules? I would step back and let him make his own decision, and he would die. We would not say that I was being a very good parent at that point. And yet that's what we're saying about God by giving us free will. Looking down, knowing all the horrific decisions that we're going to make, he allows us to cross the street no matter what the consequences. So we would call that a bad parent, but we worship that God. So I'm not saying that the free will defense probably isn't the best. Theodicy, it is, particularly from a Wesleyan perspective. But every theodicy has some logical difficulty to it. And particularly, as Brent said, when we want to say that the point is really the sufferer, not a philosophical theory. And a lot of people have wanted to answer the question of theodicy using sort of these idealistic, abstract concepts. And as a result, people who actually suffer get left behind. The two main issues of theodicy are whether or not God's power or God's goodness, you cannot hold those two logically together in light of suffering. And so even in Nazarene circles, we'll say, there have been some who have wanted to answer the problem of theodicy by questioning God's power, by saying that God cannot intervene in the world. God is not omnipotent. And that solves the problem of theodicy. Why is there suffering in the world? Because God can't. God cannot intervene. So you ask, where is God? Let's say 911, 9/11. Why didn't God intervene? God couldn't. God is not capable of doing that. So they sacrifice God's power on that side But there are theodicies that go in the other direction. And the most important of those would be the protest theology that comes from Jewish theologians after the Holocaust. They don't question God's power, they question God's goodness. How can God, if God is loving, allow such atrocities to happen? And so, is it possible to somehow negotiate these two sides of the question where it feels like we are on a knife's edge trying to walk that path of trying to negotiate those two issues? For Brent and I, again, working through this for so long, I would say if we're going to fall to one side, we're going to fall to the side of wondering about God's goodness. Protest theodicy is a theodicy that, like the Psalms in the Old Testament, want to hold God accountable for not showing up when God needs to show up. And so, in light of that, I'll give it over to Brent to talk about what those Psalms are doing and other portions of Scripture in terms of a possible way to deal with God not showing up to solve problems, but still affirming God's presence.
Thanks, Diane. Well said and well done. One of the things, and it's squeaked out for those of you who've been here most every week, it's come 2 or 3 times, is the power of lament. Lament is an act of worship. It's a protest worship. But lament is, I think, and just curiously, and I could think a lot about this, lament has just not been a part of most evangelical worship I've been a part of. One could argue the African-American tradition has probably been more faithful to the practice of lament in their worship practice. But I think that's an underutilized tool. And again, laments are, and this is going to sound like illegal worship, right? Laments are saying, God, you have failed us. God, you have let us down. God, where are you? And for those of you who've heard me before, one of my buzz lines is this. If we can't lament to God, our praise is hollow and shallow, right? Laments are our honest crying out that things are not as they should be. As Diane mentioned, one option would be to say, well, God is doing the best that God can do. And again, when you limit God's power, then actually you evaporate lament, right? If God could not do more, then laments are a waste of time, right? But laments are leaning into the place where, God, we want you to be a better and more faithful God. Now, again, in my growing up, those phrases would have sound illegal. Here's the thing. I actually think, it's in the Bible, right? I mean, it's in Scripture. And by the way, and this is a really big deal, don't we see Jesus Christ lamenting on the cross, right? I think, so I'm very influenced by Moltmann at this point, the crucified God. For those of you who have read that, the cry of dereliction from Psalm 22. And by the way, read all of the Psalm. Laments are actually grounded in hope. Laments are a form of praise. If they didn't have hope, I wouldn't be fostering the complaint. Does that make sense? If I didn't think God could do more and believe God will do more, I wouldn't bother the breath of lament, right? I think again, pastorally, what concerns me more is not the person who's angry at God, but the person who's stopped caring. And this is how protest atheism works. all of a sudden you're like, you know what? Why bother being angry? Clearly, either God is just gone here. It's easier to believe for the protest atheism. It's easier to say there's not a belief in God rather than to kind of keep holding it all together. And we are sympathetic to that because the world is not flat. There are folks who've experienced way more harm and evil than others. And, my life has been thoroughly blessed. I've been given very few reasons to not believe in God. Many people have experienced evil, and you've pastored people for whom, they've experienced so much and they have a hard time. And you're like, oh my word, I get it. Right. So I think the foundation of lament, I want to say, is grounded not in simply whining, but ultimately asking God to be present. Again, scripturally, I think it is not the best approach to limit God's power. One of the most awkward books of the Bible is Job, right? Job, to me, is the nail in the coffin for suggesting the Bible offers a theodicy, right? I mean, why is it the case? I mean, the theodicy from Job could be, right, that, well, hey, later along, that God comes alongside Job and, hey, Job, by the way, won the bet. Congratulations. You did it, right? This is a test. The whirlwind speeches of 33 and 38, when, God or Job demands God to show up and God shows up, God doesn't tell Job anything about the weird, awkward devil conversation. He just says, Job, you don't get to know why this has occurred. You're not God. And again, Diane and I want to be the first to say, at some level, when you have a theodicy approach, this will be terribly unsatisfying. The why question, and why is this happening to me, is not going to be answered in a way that's going to silence your lament. And so it's going to cause for it, right? So with that going forward, kind of the next stage that we want to lean into is, well, what does that mean then for us? I'll kind of start it, and Diane, you can pick up for it. Where in the book we go to is that God, and here's the thing, I don't think the Bible is afraid to say that God's on the hook. Nowhere in the Bible is God like trying to need to be defended. So what we would say, and this is, again, one of the classic books, Al Truesdale's book from our tradition. I encourage you to read it all, to read it for our students. It kind of guides them into kind of these conversations. If God is God, then why? But what we want to say is this. In lots of ways, but specifically, God in Jesus Christ enters into full-on humanity and experiences all of that, and most fully experiences what it is like to be the sinned against. So then this is now Moltmann's line. God becomes the God of those who've been abandoned by God. Now, we got to clarify, abandonment simply means for Moltmann, those for whom God did not stop the evil from occurring. And Jesus Christ becomes the God who is present to those who've been abandoned by God. Okay, that's kind of a thicker thing, but that's no. So what we want to say is that while God did not stop your pain from happening, God and then the church is invited to be present to you in your pain. Now, pastorally, we're certainly going to say this is not going to be God on the cross is not giving an excuse for why your evil occurred. The atonement is not a theodicy. By the way, we have a long conversation on why most atonement theories are bad theodicies, by the way. It's different, the whole different day. But to this point here, what happens to God in Christ does not then get God off the hook for the evil you experienced. But it is going to say God in Christ by the Spirit can be present to you in the midst of your pain, as well as saying to you, right, a couple of things. Number one, the pain that you've experienced is not necessarily your fault. God's not angry at you, and you're not alone. Right? Those are kind of the other weaker theodicies that we've kind of quickly ditched over, right? So, but that becomes the center of our conversation, is that God and in the church is called to be present with folks in their pain. Again, when you want to ask the why question, and pastorally, I always want to give folks a space to ask that question. Depending on the context, we are going to say there are things that we don't know why occurred, and so it's okay to be angry at God that God is allowed versus willed. I would say, again, that's a good Wesleyan distinction versus Reformed tradition. In the Reformed tradition, God wills typically all things. For a Wesleyan response, God allows, which still means God could do more and didn't. Right? So that begins the way for us for a Wesleyan response pastorally to say that God indeed did not want to happen what happened to you, but God did allow it, and God is mourning with you, and the church should mourn with you as well. Diane, do you want to pick that part up before we got turn it over to the Q&A? That was the key part about God's empathy.
Yes, so particularly for the subject matter of the book, which are victims particularly, Christ allowed himself to be victimized on the cross, and therefore has, as Brent has described very well, a deep, deep capacity, beyond words, to describe the deep capacity of Christ's ability to empathize with every kind of suffering, but particularly for us, for victims of abuse. But because we want to maintain God's power, which we do, after we are able to express lament, after we are able to experience God's infinite presence in the midst of our suffering, we also want to claim that God is the God of the resurrection. And so we don't just leave victims with a nice God who, snuggles up next to them, but the God of power who is able to raise them then from the dead of their own suffering. And so we want to ground our non-answer to theodicy in the hope of freedom in this life. Now, that might take many, many years and all sorts of means of grace, like medication, like counseling. There are more means of grace than Wesley thought of. But we do want to hope for them that even in this life, there is a higher level or quality of life that they can find. Because God is still not only the God of love, but the God of power. So lots of good stuff in the book. We hope that once we find a publisher, which we've been trying to do, that you'll take it and read it. One, I think, important chapter for us is the whole question of the responsibility of the sufferer to forgive those who have perpetrated the suffering. And that's a really important chapter. I make some claims in there about the fact that the church has bullied people into quick forgiveness, and that that is very harmful and detrimental. But one thing I think I would like to say, even though Dr. Truesdale many, many, many years ago told me this was heresy, I'm going to put it out there anyway. It's also a really important part of our theodicy. So if God is a God of love, so much love that God is willing to hang on the hook of blame, meaning the cross. He takes sin into himself through Christ. One of the things that victims have a very difficult time with is the majority of victimizers never apologize for what they have done to someone else. That's a very rare thing. And I would claim that forgiveness has to be dependent on someone's repentance. And so they have nobody repenting to forgive. Could it be that God, by putting God's self on the cross, on the hook, in love, in empathy, offers a substitutionary apology to us, whereby we can forgive God for God not alleviating our suffering. Now, if you want to, push back at me, is God to blame in some sort of, high metaphysical sense? Probably not. But God, being a God of empathy, knows that sufferers need some sort of ability to forgive, ability to let go, and that psychic need, God steps in, takes the blame, apologizes to us so that we then can find relief from our chains that binds us to our suffering. So that's what Truesdale called heresy, but I would like to say it's a heresy that works, particularly for those who suffer.
Let me add one comment, and we'll turn it over to all of you. Thanks, Diane. One of the verses I both love and hate pastorally is Romans 8:28. And it connects here all the time. You know that verse. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Thank you, Bible Quizzing, 1988. That verse is wonderful, but I want to be in charge of how it's interpreted, right? That verse has often been used in a reformed way to say that God is at work in all things, bringing all things towards good, which is to say God is willing all events. Or in fact, to be kind of disclose something to you, we got rejected by a reformed publisher, probably if they read carefully around these issues, because essentially in a reformed world, God is in control. And again, I think the Wesleyan response, if we're not careful, kind of leans so far away from that. I think you could say God is not in control. So I think that we don't want to go that far. But we do want to say that with Romans 8:28, that's the verse is not saying God caused all things, willed all things. For Wesleyan, we would say that God has allowed things. And so it's true. God can bring good from all things, even things that God did not want to happen, but God did allow. And again, for Diane and I, it is that allow piece that is crucial, that we're saying is not about what God can't do, but God chose not to. And then for us, to be frank, it's messier. It would be much easier to say God can't stop things than to say God can and doesn't. And we fully recognize, I just think with the testimony of revelation in Scripture, Scripture leaves God on the hook, and we don't want to move there. So, okay. Responses, questions, comments. I think I see all of you on my screen, so you can unmute. Diane, if you can type in on the chat. James wanted you to kind of either or say again, kind of your thing about the substitutionary apology. Let me say that one more time, and we'll turn over the rest of you what you want to say or hear.
Sorry, I missed that. What?
Sorry, James just wanted you to say again about the apology, the substitutionary apology, or type it out.
Maybe we could talk about this later, but in some, God steps in for an abuser and makes an apology through the cross because he took blame upon himself, thereby giving a victim a way to resolve or forgive. Where it's heresy is that tends to say that God is to blame, which some people are very nervous about. You also should probably say something, Brent, about COVID. We advertise that. So COVID presents in all of this the question, why does God allow this to happen? Why does God heal some people in response to the people's prayer? Why do loved ones die? So that's where it all comes together.
Yeah, well, that's great. Ruben, were you unmuted for a second there? Go ahead. You can go first, Ruben.
I was. Either of you can field this. about your book, do you go into right now in this conversation, we've been functioning more or less on the interpersonal relationships with God and talking about the experience of finite sufferers. I'm wondering if you go into the plane of generational suffering and like systemic injustices in the context of your book. Just looking forward to reading about it.
Yeah, Diane, I don't know that we do a lot, to be honest. Kind of how I got into this conversation, actually with a grad class, a PhD program in Chicago, through the issue of Han, the Asian Comes of Han, HAN, which by the way connects to Han Solo for all you Star Wars nerds. That was not an accident. And the Asian Comes of a Han does think about generational suffering and alienation. So to be honest, Ruben, I don't know that we went into either systemic or cultural or suffering in that sense, though certainly it would be germane.
Brett,
Again, go ahead.
Sorry. You do
Go ahead.
when you go through the cross and the lynching tree. Your chapter.
That's true. I forgot that part.
Yeah. So there is some of that.
Yeah. I use James Cohen's work there a little bit to think about, because both about communal guilt and communal responsibility.
Right.
Obviously, if we were writing this again today, I'm glad we're done, we need to add more on the whole sense of the racial piece and the ways in which in our current United States context, obviously all sufferers are to be considered, but for the African American community, the incarceration rates, the lack of the financial disparities. So certainly it's an issue warranted, though I forgot we did that a little bit with Cohen's work there. Yeah, but it's still connected. But yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it is germane, and there are ways in which to address it. And you've said as much. It just the issue of forgiveness at the communal scale and hope across generations becomes that much more messy and complicated.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, Ruben. You're right. With its First Nations peoples, African Americans, folks who care, what do we do? No, you're exactly right. In some regard, at the granular level, individual level, it's cleaner, if that's a better word. But you're right, how we then address that. And that's worthy of great reflection by the church. So great comment. Yep. Anybody else? A comment, question? I'll know by your unmuting you want to say something.
I got a question. First of all, it's really timely. I have a woman this week who's a terminal cancer patient who is struggling to find the belief in God she wants to have because of Theodicy. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that there's a different approach, both practically and then theologically or philosophically. So I'm wondering, practical ideas that we can employ pastorally to talk to people in this scenario would be part one. And part two is, I always feel like part of my response to Theodicy has been the responsibility that God gives the church to be his hands and feet, and that part of the blame lies in the church for the failure to do the good that we know we ought to do, and that perhaps the suffering we see is certainly at times cannot be blamed on anybody, but there is also suffering that I think we could say perhaps it exists because people were called and refused to go, and the suffering incurred or continued. And so the blame doesn't necessarily lie with God as much as it lies with his people. I don't know how that fits. I've never really thought about it. I'm just curious your response to that and how you would. Is that like way out there, or can you make that?
Yeah, it's great. Go ahead, Diane. That's great.
That's really wonderful. And in fact, at the end of our resurrection chapter, we talk about needing to be new creation communities, to be the ones, to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to create the space that many people need to find a sense of belonging, presence, love, acceptance, etc. A few years ago, I read on Facebook this quote, that great source of wisdom, that said this: I asked God why there was so much suffering in the world and why he didn't do anything about it. Then God asked me the same question. There are ways that we are to be the very extension of Christ's love. So yeah, spot on point, James. Very good.
Yeah, I would just add, pastorally, again, this is now a philosophical response, not a pastoral one. I don't think all suffering is evil. I don't think death is necessarily evil. Physical death is evil. Pastorally, I think we want to say that God is at work in the world, but never promises a life that is free from hardship. Again, that's where I think it's really important to discern evil suffering from just life being just suffering. I think that it's danger to assume it's all the same. But with that being said, I think you're right, James. God calls the church to be present to those in the midst of their questions and expectations. But in our preaching too, I think how we think about what this Christian life is going to be like can be helpful. I think, again, as I would tell my students, Jesus said, if you're going to be Christian, that's awesome. Your life will now be harder. It will not be easier. And again, to the lady who's in suffering in a hospital bed, that isn't that message. But we want to pray that God is with you, and that we would say, in that sense, in that context, James, our response would be as a pastor, we don't believe this life is it, and we want you to be as limited pain as you can be in. But our hope isn't in simply this life lasting forever. But again, pastorally, every time is about context there. So good. Anybody else? Question, comment? Eric, you're off.
Yeah, it's kind of a double question. I have a senior who missed out on a lot of things this year, and we can all, pat someone on the back and say, well, prom's no big deal. But when there's other things they've been training for, and this is the final year to do it, and they can't, they truly miss out on something. And so the idea of communal responsibility for our young people, especially comes into the fore right now as our schools here are not getting back together. There's all this talk about online, and everybody needs to be online. And our community is fully aware that probably half or more of the kids will be home alone. And I don't even want to think about victimization that can happen. I'm more thinking about, we give a kid's computer and say, hey, this is a good substitute for school. Why don't you do this for a year? And assume there will be no consequences to our kids developmentally. Makes me want to become a children's pastor and say, you know what? If they're not going to provide interpersonal interaction, I feel a responsibility for me to provide ministry for children. So maybe they can have more time with other Christians, and that's great and wonderful. But I'm just trying to think through all this. We're making these big ethical decisions, this, not this, that have consequences. And we're not all really communally talking about it, except for maybe in protest and in lament, but not ethically. We don't have, pastors aren't the ethical advisors for our governors, so to speak. We don't have a good ethical framework for these huge decisions that are happening, other than very small ways. So when the teachers union now is talking to the school district about childcare, this is one of the few windows of opportunity to discuss the problem, but it's not the way I would like to discuss it. So I think right now we're experiencing a huge thing, and we're not really talking about it in terms of leaders with leaders. I'm not sure what to do with that. I feel a burden of responsibility, and I don't know what to do with that right now.
It's good. Yeah,
I think, Eric, I think it's a call for the church to be present. Again, I'm not sure your community. In our area, we have a lot of folks who are 2-parent working households and have not awesome income. And you're right. There are children who they have to work to eat. So how can churches step into that in a responsible way? But I share that burden with you, and we just pray as a church that we keep working together and say, how can we in a loving way care for these kids for whom are all alone with a computer? And so I appreciate your heart, and I think it's a call for the church to be active there.
We're trying to arrange for a co-op childcare where parents can hopefully get some time off and they can share childcare together. But most teachers are told, hey, come to work 7:30 to 3:30. Oh, by the way, don't bring your kids. We can't have them in the empty classrooms with you. And I know the teachers unions have a word about that, but at some point, if schools aren't even willing to flex, I don't know. I'm just trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
It is very hard under the guise of safety. It's very hard. Yeah. And I think one of the things we would say too is to be both present and humble, but to be courageous. And I would say in the right and responsible way. I think there's bad courage and good courage, if you know what I'm saying. So great. Thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate your heart on that question. Other comments or questions or thoughts?
Hans?
Or things to push back on?
Yeah, I want to say that I really appreciate what you said. I think it was you, Brent, who said lament is an act of worship, a form of praise, and it is rooted in hope. Because the idea that God can't is really something that leads me to despair. And lament leaves room for hope. And I'm actually working on a sermon on lament, and I started out with Habakkuk 1, where the prophet says, "Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" I mean, usually the prophets blame us, right? But the prophet blames God. And he does. So there is a place for blaming of God in the scriptures, and it's not a heresy. I think unless you want to make Habakkuk a heretic, but I think it's not. So it's very helpful, I think, that we learn to deal with lament, because usually, at least in our church, we don't. We sing all these, not really only happy clappy songs, but it's all praise. And I think, give me a break, not all of our lives are praise. No, we suffer at times, and we don't understand, we don't get it. But we have no liturgical place for that. So I'm grateful for your words here. They are helpful.
For about 2 years, I ran at our church a survivors group, those who have been victimized. And one of the things that they directly said is how left out they feel in our worship services, how alone and isolated, because nobody will acknowledge the kind of pain that they have suffered. So we do need to be really aware that, happy makes people feel ostracized.
It's curious, Hans, that we are willing to do our praise communally, but we force folks ironically, in their pain, to do it in isolation. And we give them no account. I would not changing subject. This is to me why Black Lives Matter, with all its complexity, is so crucial. Why are we afraid to address the pain of those in our community who are hurting? As a community, I think for some reason we feel it's a threat to hear when someone's in pain. But in the church, we have got to create better spaces. And I'm not sure communal worship is the only place. But certainly, let's sing a song about how God, you failed us this week, because you let Joe die in a car accident, right? I mean, we again, this is not. People's lives are complex, and if we don't allow them corporately to name, so even though my week was okay, if Diane's week sucked, let's Romans 12:15, right? Bible quizzers, right? Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. We don't do that very well. And so, Hans, you're exactly right. We must find the space to come alongside communally in folks' pain, to name it and acknowledge it together in solidarity. We're saying this is not good. Yeah. Someone else had a hand. John, did you have a hand, John Prevett? I thought I saw you flash up a little bit ago. You want to go? We have time. We're good. Go ahead, John.
I just really appreciate the conversation, because people are getting lots of information from lots of places that are just strange. The Theodicy thing, for me, I think people kind of jump into some kind of eschatological rubric of some kind. I've been asked this question a lot about COVID, like, you know, how does this fit with the signs of the times? I met with a guy, he had a book at Costco, like 100 signs of the times, and I looked at it with him, and turned out it was a guy that taught at BYU, and I said, did you read that half the book's Doctrine and Covenants? And I said, don't mean to be mean to you, but people are grasping for even a bad worldview. And it's amazing to me how far they will go to grab onto the worst possible ideas that are, and it's abusive, it's religious, I'm taking this bad old model that's never worked, and I'm going to replay that model over and over and over again until people just submit to it. And like somehow this is how God's going to finish the human existence. All these things are going to get worse and worse. We're sorry for the English, but that's how they think and how they feel, and kind of like this kind of despair. I like what you said, Hans, in the sense that we have a culture, even worship music, of despair. Like, things are going to get so bad, and then we're going to have this rapture thing happen, which I know that word's in the Bible, not. Anyway, it's just amazing to me what we will do to escape, what we will do. We'll throw our minds out to fix our hearts. Let me just say it that way. So
yeah, I do think, John. Yeah, I think, and Scott, I'll get you next. I sorry I missed you, Scott, earlier. Scottson. I do think people would rather have a bad view of God than the lack of as a place of certainty. For some people, it's easier to say God is willing every event, as awful as that is, because they don't want the uncertainty that exists. And so you're right, because that ambiguity and uncertainty is there. Folks are going to adopt many things in order to make themselves supposedly feel better. So, Diane, do you want to respond? Then we'll turn it over to Scott.
No, just say good point, Jonathan. People will want easy answers now instead of the complexity of these theological and pastoral issues. Even if it seems totally illogical or wrong, or puts God in a bad light, or misrepresents evil, easy answers are the king of the day right now. This is too complex to think through, even for preachers. And so they throw out there things that work rather than truth.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, good. Thanks. First of all, just Brent and Diane, thanks so much for today and dealing with this. Thanks for also wading in with the book and getting into the weeds on these kinds of things. I appreciate the mental energy. This is great when academia is informing the church on these important things. Well, yeah, so much even in our conversation. I think of just last week, I had a conversation with a guy from our congregation of, if we are mourning as a congregation, that doesn't mean the Spirit isn't moving. His understanding was, when I feel up and happy, that's the Spirit moving. It's like, no, the Spirit moves in lament as well. So there's maybe a teaching piece there for us as pastors. Pastorally, this really hits home for me right now. We had a couple 2 weeks ago that both contracted COVID. The wife went into the hospital and was released 48 hours later with hardly any symptoms, while the husband died in the hospital. And so we're, as a congregation, wrestling with exactly like Dr. Leclerc said. We prayed for both of them equally. And now what do? She's recovered and he's gone. And also that she's now on 2-week quarantine. So we can't even plan a memorial service until she and the family are off quarantine. But it kind of in thinking what you were sharing there, I'm leaning hard on John 11. You know, Martha comes right out and says, Jesus, where were you? If you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus gives kind of that two-pronged response. Well, in the present, I'm right here to mourn with you. But in the future, I am the resurrection and the life. I'm the resurrection now. So kind of as Hans and John was talking about, there is a bit of an eschatology there for us of the already and the not yet. In the present, I'm here to mourn with you. I'm going to enter into that suffering and weep with you. But don't forget the hope that is out there, which Brent, you referenced in Romans 8. That's the whole point that leads up to Romans 8:28, that the whole creation is groaning, but yet will be redeemed just as we as the children of God have been redeemed. So today's discussion has been helpful in me formulating my funeral eulogy for this for this gentleman, for us as a congregation, as we try to mourn and make sense of things that can't make sense, but to still give us hope. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Scott. And as you are displaying pastorally, the issue of presence is so crucial. And even as there are questions that linger about the why, and those are real questions, that we're called just to be present in the midst of the not having great answers. So it's a good questions. And again, the eschatology is important. Our hope in the resurrection does not mute our mourning today, but we are people who do have hope. And so that fine balance between being honest with our pain today and not an escapist eschatology, but yet still affirming that the hope is that this life is not the end. And so we do mourn and lament and cry. But again, as Hans said, we do so as people who have hope, not naive, Gnostic escape hope, but hope that God is at work, even in the midst of the real pain that we're experiencing today. So,
And just to add on to that, that's why it's so crucial that the early church was smart and affirmed as orthodox bodily resurrection.
right.
These people will have their bodies restored and redeemed.
Well, friends, we've hit 12:03. We can do one more question, and I'm so thankful for Diane for her time today. One last question or comment for our group. Well, I'm thrilled that we answered. Oh, Cheryl, were you going for the mute, Cheryl, or are you just adjusting your computer?
No, I was going for let's see here. Let me get back
Go
to
for it.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been awesome. Over here in South Africa, obviously we hear a lot of lament over the years of apartheid, and it's been difficult for me because I grew up as a privileged person in this context as a child, and I was totally unaware of what was going on with my fellow humans. And now I sit in life group every week, and I will hear that lament of what it means to have lived through and still actually live in a society that is free. Yes, it's free, but it's still, I guess that generational thing still comes through. So thank you so much, because for me, there are times when pastorally, you don't have anything to say. And sometimes you don't even have any guidance to give. But I guess the best thing is just to sit with the person.
Presence and listening.
And sometimes I weep. I don't know anything else. And then a couple of weeks ago, we were privileged to hear a young priest. She is with the Anglican Church. And she did a talk on how difficult it is because they have asked the Anglican priests to give them guidance to give pastoral care to the LGBTQ plus community, just pastoral care, not right or wrong, biblical, whatever, but just how to be able to pray over and pray with, because at this point within their policy, they are restricted even in giving a blessing to the children of gay couples. And you could hear her pain and her lament as a pastor to not be able to give the care as an ordained priest in that worshiping community. So it's very complex. So thank you. Really appreciate what you guys
Yeah.
said.
Awesome. Diane and Brain Fuzz.
Thanks, Tedders. A blessing to hear your perspective. And yeah, I do think, Cheryl, we never want to underestimate the pastoral place of presence and listening and weeping. It's not always in our answers, but in our presence and our mourning that we're in solidarity with those through the ongoing laments of their life. And that's a great ministry for sure. Yeah. Diane, you get the last word. What would you say to these great friends and pastors today?
We always want to be a resource to you at NNU, not just through these once a week things, but if you have something you want to talk through, pick up the phone. We're always here. And I will add that Brent Peterson is the best dean of the school, of any school, anywhere. He is awesome. And to get to work with him has been a true blessing. I call him my priest as well as my boss.
Well, you're kind. It's a blessing to be with you, Diane. Well, friends, it's been a great time. I've been really encouraged by your presence. My kind of benediction is a blessing on you and your ministry, and especially in the hard places that, as Eric named others, COVID is hard, right? James, we're just a pastor of a website. I mean, this is a hard time, and let's not run away from its hardness. Its hardness is complex, and there's no easy solution, but let us lean into hope in the midst of our laments and our mourning. But let's not, my prayer is that we would embrace what God can teach me and teach us through this very difficult time. And to be aware of how it also, as we were hearing with Scott, it doesn't happen equally. Even in one household, the mom, the wife lives and the husband dies. Life is complex and weird. And so within all of that, we just need God's grace, all that. So blessings on all of you. Thanks for all you're doing. And survive your warm or cool August day. Grace and peace. By the way, I will, real quick before you go, the lifelong learning code today. I'll put it in the email, but the code today, sorry, I got so excited about to add it in there. Usually I'm talking less. The code today is, I'll say it slowly, 47344. Again, 47344. And so if that is a help to you and you want to record that, that would be great. And I'll send this recording out. We had a lot of requests for this recording, so we're going to go ahead and make it public today. But I'll email you that link, but I'll also put that link also in the email thread I started yesterday where I found several of you. So anyway, grace and peace. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
It was awesome. This one.